The dusty road stretched out endlessly before the windshield of the old truck, a ribbon of pale calico cutting through the heart of the Texas scrubland. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt, distorting the horizon where the blue sky met the scorched earth, creating the illusion of water where there was only dry, unforgiving dirt. It was the kind of road that held secrets in its cracks, the kind of road where a man could drive for hours and hear nothing but the hum of tires and the whisper of his own conscience. This was the memory that played in George Strait's mind, a loop of comfort and familiarity, the smell of sagebrush and heated leather filling his senses. But then, the image shattered. The dusty road dissolved into a blinding white glare. The hum of the tires was replaced by the low, menacing thrum of high-powered cooling fans. The smell of sagebrush vanished, overtaken by the sterile, metallic scent of ozone and recycled air. George Strait blinked, his blue eyes adjusting not to the wide-open plains, but to the claustrophobic brilliance of a 60-inch ultra-high-definition monitor. He was not in his truck. He was sitting in a chair that cost more than his first horse, suspended 40 floors above the concrete sprawl of downtown Dallas, trapped in a glass cage that the modern world called an executive office. George shifted his weight, the leather of the ergonomic chair creaking beneath him. He felt strangely small in this room, despite his stature. At 71, the king of country still carried himself with the quiet, imposing grace of a man who had spent a lifetime commanding stages and breaking horses. But here in the headquarters of Veritas Ancestry, he felt like an artifact on display. He adjusted the brim of his resistal hat, which sat on his knee, his fingers brushing against the felt, a tactile anchor in a sea of smooth, cold surfaces. Beside him, on the sleek obsidian desk, lay a battered, weather-stained leather satchel. It contained the physical soul of his family, the handwritten journals of his grandfather, Jedediah Strait. Paper that had survived floods, droughts, and the passage of a century. George had brought them here to be preserved, to be digitized for his grandchildren, so that the ink wouldn't fade into oblivion. He had come with noble intentions. He had come to save history. He had no idea he was walking into an ambush. Across the desk sat Julian Thorne, the director of historical data mining at Veritas. Julian was a man who looked as if he had never felt the bite of a mosquito or the sting of a callus. He was young, sharply dressed in a suit that was too tight, with thick-rimmed glasses that magnified eyes devoid of empathy. Julian didn't look at people. He looked through them, scanning for data points. He was typing furiously on a silent keyboard, his face illuminated by the blue glow of 3 different screens. "Mr. Strait," Julian said, his voice smooth and synthetic, like a generated narration. "You have to understand, what we do here at Veritas isn't just scanning paper. Any intern with a flatbed scanner can do that. We excavate the truth. We use proprietary algorithms to cross-reference your family's personal anecdotes with state, federal, and obscure municipal records from the last 200 years. We find the ghosts in the machine." George cleared his throat. The air in the room was so dry it made his throat itch. "I appreciate the technology, son, I really do. But I just want to make sure these diaries are safe. My grandfather wrote down everything about how he built the ranch, the hard winters, the cattle drives. I want my grandson to read it on his iPad, I suppose. That's the way the world is going." Julian stopped typing. He spun his chair around, a thin, patronizing smile playing on his lips. "The way the world is going, Mr. Strait, is toward transparency. Total, unadulterated transparency. People think they know their heroes. They think they know their lineage. But data? Data doesn't care about legends. Data doesn't care about songs." George felt a prickle of unease at the base of his neck, the same instinct that warned him when a storm was brewing over the ridge. "My grandfather was a good man, hard worker, honest as the day is long. There aren't any ghosts to find, just a lot of sweat and prayer." Julian's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That is the romantic version, the oral tradition. But let's see what the Veritas engine has found. We ran a preliminary background check on the names mentioned in the first volume you sent over last week. Just standard procedure before we accept the project." Julian reached for his mouse. The sound of the click was sharp, echoing in the silent room like the cocking of a hammer on a revolver. On the massive screen facing George, the Veritas logo spun and dissolved, replaced by a complex web of lines and names. It zoomed in rapidly, focusing on the year 1923. A red bar pulsed at the bottom of the screen. George leaned forward, squinting. "What is this?" "We found a match," Julian said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "A digital footprint from a digitized county clerk archive in a basement 3 counties over. It was never indexed until our AI crawled through it last night." The screen flashed, and a document appeared. It was grainy, a digital scan of old yellowed paper, but the typewriter font was legible, enhanced by the computer's sharpening filters. It was a police report, a warrant. George read the words, and his heart, usually a steady drumbeat, skipped a beat. Warrant for arrest issued October 14, 1923. Suspect Jedediah Strait. Charges: grand larceny, land fraud, falsification of deeds regarding the Morgan Creek territory. George felt the blood drain from his face. This is a mistake," he murmured, his voice rough. "My grandfather bought that land. He worked 10 years as a hand to save the money for the down payment. I have the deed. I have his journals explaining the purchase." Julian shook his head slowly, clicking the mouse again. The screen shifted to show a side-by-side comparison. On the left, the deed George claimed to have. On the right, a forensic analysis overlay. According to the algorithm, the deed recorded in family history matches the characteristics of forgeries produced by a known syndicate in the 1920s. And this police report? It suggests your grandfather didn't buy the land, Mr. Strait. He stole it. He defrauded a widow named Eleanor Morgan and chased her off the property with threats of violence. That is a lie, George's voice boomed, filling the glass office. For a second, the polite cowboy was gone, replaced by a man defending his blood. He stood up, the chair rolling back aggressively. Jedediah Strait was a deacon in the church. He fed half the town during the Depression. He wouldn't steal a pebble, let alone 1,000 acres. Julian didn't flinch. He seemed to enjoy the outburst. He tapped a key and a new window popped up. It was a draft of a press release. "Mr. Strait, please, sit down. Emotion is the enemy of truth. The document is here. The digital stamp verifies its source. In the modern world, if it's in the database, it is reality. And at Veritas, we have a policy. If we discover historical crimes of significant magnitude involving public figures, we have a duty to the public record." George stared at the man, horrified. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Julian said, leaning back and tenting his fingers, "that this is a viral story. The king of country's kingdom built on stolen land. It's tragic, really. But it's the data. We are preparing to release the findings as part of our Hidden Histories promotional campaign next week." George felt the room spinning. He looked at the screen again. The glowing pixels seemed to burn into his retinas. Fraud. Thief. The words mocked him. He looked down at the leather satchel on the desk, the physical reality of his grandfather's life, and then back at the cold blue lie on the screen. He wished he had never walked into this building. He wished he had never clicked agree on their terms of service. He wished he had stayed on the dusty road of his memories, where the truth was something you could touch, not something a machine spat out to ruin a family's name. "You can't do that," George said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know the context. You don't know the man." "We know the data," Julian retorted, his tone icy. "And the data says your legacy is a fraud." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. George Strait, a man who had faced down bulls and played to millions, felt completely disarmed. He was fighting a ghost in a machine, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he could win. The setup was perfect, and the trap was sprung. George sank back into the chair, his eyes fixed on the damning document. The cursor on the screen blinked rhythmically, like a countdown. Julian watched him, the predator watching the prey, waiting for the capitulation. But deep in George's eyes, beneath the shock and the hurt, a small spark ignited. It was the same spark that had kept him in the saddle when the bronco tried to kill him. It was the resolve of a man who knew that the truth wasn't always what appeared on a screen. But to find it, he would have to navigate a world he barely understood. The air conditioner hummed, a cold wind blowing through the graveyard of his family's reputation, and George Strait sat there, the weight of 1923 crushing down on him, wishing, praying that he could unsee what the internet had just shown him. The journey through the Veritas Ancestry building had been designed to intimidate. From the moment George stepped out of the elevator on the 40th floor, he was assaulted by a vision of the future that had no room for the past he cherished. The lobby was a cavern of white marble and glass, so polished that George could see the reflection of his boots with perfect clarity as he walked. There were no receptionists, only touchscreens, no warmth, only the hum of efficiency. He had felt the eyes of the young employees on him as he was escorted to Julian's office. They were kids, really, in their 20s, wearing hoodies and holding tablets, whispering as the man in the cowboy hat walked by. They knew who he was, of course. Everyone in Texas knew George Strait, but their looks weren't of adoration, they were looks of curiosity, like one might look at a dinosaur in a museum exhibit. Inside Julian's office, the feeling of alienation intensified. The walls were actually floor-to-ceiling screens displaying shifting family trees and data streams from around the globe. It was impressive, George had to admit, but it felt soulless. It felt like a factory where ancestors were processed into content. "You see, Mr. Strait," Julian continued, breaking George's train of thought. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Dallas skyline. "The problem with your generation is that you rely on nostalgia. You rely on stories told around a campfire. Grandpa was a hero. Great-grandma was a saint. It makes you feel good. It gives you a sense of identity. But nostalgia is a liar. History is messy. History is brutal. And for the first time, we have the tools to clean it up." Julian turned back, his face illuminated by the city lights. "This document, the Morgan Warrant, it changes everything about the Strait narrative. Think about the songs you sing, the values you project, honesty, hard work. If the foundation of the ranch, the very land you walk on, was stolen from a widow, then every song is a hypocrisy, isn't it?" George gripped the armrests of the chair until his knuckles turned white. The insult was direct, calculated to wound. "My songs are about life," George said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "And my grandfather's life was about survival. He bought that land fair and square. I remember him telling me about the day he signed the papers. He said his hand shook because he had never written a check that big." "Memory is fallible," Julian dismissed, waving a hand. "The document is dated. It is signed by a sheriff. It outlines the scheme. Apparently, Jedediah Strait forged a signature on a transfer of title while Mrs. Morgan was ill. When she recovered and tried to reclaim her property, he used his connections to have her silenced. The warrant was issued, but, and here is the interesting part, it was never served. It disappeared. Buried. Until now." Julian walked back to the desk and leaned over, bringing his face close to George's. "We believe he paid off the sheriff. Corruption. Another stain on the legacy." George looked at the man's smug face and felt a surge of nausea. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the joy Julian took in it. This wasn't about truth for Julian, it was about power. It was about taking down a giant to prove that nothing is sacred. "Why are you doing this?" George asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I came here as a customer. I trusted you with my family's history." "And we are providing the service," Julian smiled. "The service of truth. But also, think of the engagement, Mr. Strait. When we release these findings, Veritas Ancestry will be on every news channel in the world. The company that debunked the cowboy myth. It's business. Surely a man of your success understands business." George looked at the leather satchel. Inside, the journal sat in silence. He thought of the pages he had read 100 times, the handwriting that changed as his grandfather aged, the ink spots, the smell of tobacco and old paper. There was a truth in those pages that this machine couldn't see. He knew it. He could feel it in his bones. But how could he prove it against a digital scan that looked so official? "I want to see the original," George said suddenly. Julian blinked. "Excuse me? The original paper. The warrant. You have a scan. Where is the paper?" Julian laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Mr. Strait, the paper is in a basement archive 300 miles away, likely crumbling to dust. We don't need the paper. The scan is high resolution. It has been verified by 3 different authentication protocols. The paper is irrelevant." "Paper is never irrelevant," George said, his voice hardening. Paper has texture, paper has watermarks. Paper tells a story that a picture can't. You are grasping at straws, Julian sighed, checking his watch. Look, I understand this is a shock. We are willing to give you 24 hours to prepare a statement before we go public. We can even help you draft an apology. It would look good for your image. Country legend acknowledges ancestral sins, so it plays well with the modern demographic, redemption arc and all that. An apology for a crime his grandfather didn't commit. The thought made George's blood boil. He stood up slowly, grabbing his hat and the satchel. He felt a profound sense of isolation. He was in a tower of glass, surrounded by enemies who spoke a language of zeros and ones, armed only with a bag of old books and his own integrity. I don't need your help writing an apology, George said, placing his hat on his head. The brim cast a shadow over his eyes, hiding the turmoil within. And I don't need your 24 hours. You do what you think you have to do. But remember this, son. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its boots. But the truth eventually gets its boots on. Julian smirked, unimpressed. That's a cute saying, Mr. Strait. But in the digital age, the truth is whatever trends on Twitter. And tomorrow, you are going to be trending for all the wrong reasons. George turned and walked toward the door. His boots clicked rhythmically on the polished floor, a sound of defiance in the silent office. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he might lose his temper, and that would only give Julian more ammunition. As he reached the elevator, George pressed the button and leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the doors. He closed his eyes. The image of the document burned in his mind. Jedediah Strait. Thief. It couldn't be true. He knew the man who had raised him. He knew the hands that had taught him to rope, the voice that had read him scripture. But the doubt, the insidious digital doubt, it was like a virus. What if he was wrong? What if the hero of his life was a villain? The elevator pinged, and the doors slid open. George stepped inside, alone. As the car descended, dropping him back down to the earth, he clutched the satchel to his chest. He felt a deep, aching regret. He wished he had never sought out Veritas. He wished he had left the past alone, but the box was open now. The dark truth was out. And as he walked out of the building into the blinding Texas heat, George Strait knew one thing. He was in for the fight of his life. Not for money, not for fame, but for the only thing that really mattered when the ride was over. His name. The heat of the parking lot hit him like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the refrigerated air of the Veritas Tower. George walked to his truck, a heavy-duty pickup that had seen more mud than car washes. He unlocked the door and climbed in, the familiar scent of the cab offering a momentary sanctuary. He sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. His hands were shaking slightly, not from age, but from a mixture of rage and fear. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at the black screen. It was a portal to the same world Julian lived in, a world where accusations were facts and context was irrelevant. He thought about calling his lawyer. He thought about calling his publicist. But what could they do? They would talk about damage control. They would talk about spinning the narrative. George didn't want spin. He wanted the truth. He looked over at the passenger seat where he had placed the satchel. The journals seemed to vibrate with a silent plea. Read us, they seemed to say. Trust us. George started the engine. The rumble of the diesel was a comfort. He backed out of the parking space, leaving the shadow of the skyscraper behind. He wasn't going home. Not yet. He had a memory. A faint, distant memory of a story his grandfather had told him once late at night when the coyotes were howling. A story about a man named Morgan. Not a widow. A man. A rival. Julian had said, Widow Eleanor Morgan. But George remembered the name Silas Morgan. The computer said one thing. His memory said another. George steered the truck onto the highway, merging into the traffic leaving Dallas. He wasn't going to the ranch. He was going to the library, not the digital archive, but the old county library in the town where his grandfather had grown up. The place with the microfiche and the dusty basements. The place Julian had mocked. You think you have the truth trapped in your servers, George muttered to the empty cab. his eyes narrowing as he looked at the road ahead. "But you forgot one thing, son. You forgot that computers only know what people tell them. And people lie." As he drove, the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of purple and bruised orange. It was a beautiful, tragic sky. George felt the weight of the coming storm. By tomorrow morning, the world might think his family was rotten to the core. He had one night to find something in the physical world that could stand up to the digital one. He reached over and turned on the radio. A classic country station was playing. His own voice filled the cab, singing about heartaches and honky-tonks. It felt surreal, listening to himself while his entire identity hung in the balance. He turned the volume down. He needed silence. He needed to think. The road stretched out before him, no longer the dusty trail of his memory, but a hard, paved highway leading into the unknown. George Strait, the king of country, was just a man in a truck now, racing against an algorithm that had already decided his fate. And deep down, a cold fear gripped his heart. What if Julian was right? What if the journals were the lie, and the cold blue screen was the only truth left? The tires of the truck crunched over the gravel lot of the San Gabriel County Library, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet of the rural night. It was past 9 o'clock, and the building, a sturdy brick structure that had stood since the oil boom of the 30s, was dark. The windows were black eyes staring out at the empty street, reflecting the lone streetlight that buzzed intermittently overhead. George Strait killed the engine, and silence rushed back in, heavy and thick like a wool blanket. He sat there for a moment, the vibration of the road still humming in his hands. His phone sat on the dashboard, silent now, but its screen was a constant reminder of the ticking clock. Julian Thorne had given him a deadline, a grace period that felt more like a stay of execution. By morning, the world would be told that the Strait legacy was built on theft. George grabbed the leather satchel from the passenger seat. It felt heavier now, as if the accusations had added physical weight to the paper inside. He stepped out into the night air. It was cooler here than in Dallas, the air smelling of damp earth and cut grass, a scent that usually brought him peace. Tonight it only brought a sharp pang of nostalgia for a time when a man's word was his bond and a handshake was stronger than any contract. He walked up the concrete steps to the library's heavy oak doors. They were locked, of course. He knew they would be. But George didn't turn around. He raised a fist and knocked, 3 solid, rhythmic raps that echoed through the wood. He waited. A minute passed, then another. He knocked again, harder this time. He wasn't George Strait the superstar right now. He was a man trying to save his family's name, and he would knock until his knuckles bled if he had to. "We are closed," she said sharply, her voice cracking with age. "Come back at 9 tomorrow." "Mrs. Gable, it's me," George said softly, taking off his hat and holding it against his chest. "It's George. I need your help." The old woman paused, adjusting her spectacles. She peered closer and her expression softened from suspicion to surprise. "George Strait. Lord have mercy, boy. What are you doing lurking on my porch at this hour? You look like you've been dragged behind a horse." "I feel like it too," George admitted, a weary smile touching his lips. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am, truly I am, but it's an emergency. It's about Jedediah, about the old records." Mrs. Gable undid the chain and opened the door wide. "Come in then. Don't let the moths in." The library smelled of dust and vanilla, the scent of decaying paper that George found infinitely more comforting than the antiseptic smell of the Veritas office. Mrs. Gable led him to a wooden table in the back, near the section dedicated to local history. She switched on a green-shaded banker's lamp, creating a pool of warm yellow light in the vast darkness of the room. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" she asked, pulling out a chair for herself. "I can see it in your eyes. You have the same look your daddy had when the drought of '54 hit." George sat down, placing the satchel on the table. He didn't have the energy to lie. "There's a company in Dallas, high-tech folks. They dug up something, Mrs. Gable. A police warrant from 1923. They say my grandfather stole the land, that he defrauded a widow named Morgan." Mrs. Gable frowned, the lines on her forehead deepening. "Morgan? There haven't been Morgans in this county for 60 years. And Jedediah Strait?" That man was so honest he'd walk 3 miles to return a penny he found on the sidewalk. That's what I told them, George said, his voice tight. But they have a scan, a warrant for arrest. It looks real, and they're going to publish it tomorrow unless I can prove otherwise. Mrs. Gable scoffed, a sound of pure dismissal. Computers. They have no sense of nuance. A piece of paper is just a snapshot, George. It doesn't tell you what happened 5 minutes before or 5 minutes after. You want the truth? You have to dig for it. She stood up and walked toward a row of filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened since the moon landing. These are the undigitized archives, she said over her shoulder. The county clerk dumped them here in the 90s when they ran out of space. Said it was junk, I said it was history. George joined her. What are we looking for? The docket, she said, pulling open a drawer that squealed in protest. If there was a warrant, there was a judge. If there was a judge, there was a docket. And if your grandfather was the man I think he was, there's more to this story than a piece of paper. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the library were the rustling of paper and the ticking of the wall clock. George felt the exhaustion seeping into his bones. His eyes burned from straining to read the faded cursive of long-dead clerks. They went through box after box of court records, property tax receipts and town council minutes. It was tedious, back-breaking work. It was the antithesis of the Veritas algorithm that could scan 1,000,000 pages in a second. But George felt a strange satisfaction in it. This was real work. This was how you built a fence, post by post, wire by wire. You didn't just press a button. Around midnight, George's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. A message from Julian, an image attachment. It was a mock-up of a magazine cover. The Strait fraud, how the West was stolen. George felt a wave of despair wash over him. He dropped his head into his hands. Maybe Julian was right. Maybe they wouldn't find anything. Maybe the warrant was the end of the story. I'm chasing ghosts, Mrs. Gable, George whispered. Maybe I just don't want to believe it. Maybe he did it. Desperate times make people do desperate things. Mrs. Gable slammed a ledger shut, the sound startling George. Don't you dare, George Harvey Strait. Don't you dare let some city boy with a laptop rewrite the man you knew. You are tired, that's all. Now look here. She pointed to a dusty, leather-bound volume she had just pulled from the bottom shelf. It was labeled Civil and Criminal Proceedings, 1923-1924. George pulled the book toward him. He opened it carefully, the spine cracking. He ran his finger down the index. Smith, Stevens, Stone, Strait. There. Strait. Jedediah versus Morgan, Silas. George frowned. Silas? The warrant said the victim was Eleanor Morgan. Why was it listed as Strait versus Morgan? That would mean Jedediah was the plaintiff, not the defendant. He turned to page 412. The page was brittle, brown with age, but the ink was black and firm. It was a transcript of a court hearing. George began to read, his lips moving silently with the words. Case 892, November 2nd, 1923. Presiding Judge, Honorable Thaddeus Miller. Plaintiff, Jedediah Strait. Defendant, Silas Morgan. Summary. Plaintiff alleges that defendant, Silas Morgan, attempted to extort property rights by means of forgery and intimidation, specifically the fabrication of a police warrant dated October 14, 1923, accusing plaintiff of fraud against one Eleanor Morgan. George stopped breathing. He read the sentence again. Fabrication of a police warrant. The warrant Julian had found. The damning evidence. It wasn't a state document. It was a forgery created by a con man named Silas Morgan to blackmail Jedediah. George's hands shook as he turned the page. He needed more. He needed the verdict. Testimony of Sheriff Calm. The warrant presented by Mr. Morgan does not bear my official seal, nor does the signature match my hand. Furthermore, Mrs. Eleanor Morgan passed away in 1921, 2 years prior to the alleged fraud, leaving no heirs. Mr. Silas Morgan is a distant cousin with no legal claim to the land. Verdict. We find the defendant, Silas Morgan, guilty of forgery, attempted extortion, and filing false instruments. Sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary. George sat back, the air rushing into his lungs as if he had been holding his breath for 100 years. Tears pricked his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and vindication. His grandfather hadn't stolen the land. He had fought for it. He had stood up to a criminal who tried to use a fake badge and a fake paper to take what wasn't his. Veritas had found the fake warrant. Their algorithm had indexed it as a real legal document because it looked like one. But they hadn't found the court case that proved it was a lie because the court case referenced the warrant as Exhibit A and didn't index the warrant's text separately in the digital archives Julian used. The AI saw "warrant for arrest" and stopped looking. It lacked the human context to understand that a document could exist as evidence of a crime about the document itself. Mrs. Gable leaned over his shoulder, reading the text through her thick glasses. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Looks like your grandpa didn't just buy the land. He saved it from a crook." George let out a laugh, a rough, joyous sound. "He's been dead 30 years, and he's still teaching me lessons." He reached for his satchel and pulled out the physical diaries he had brought from Veritas. He hadn't opened them in the office because Julian had been so aggressive. Now, with the date in mind, November 1923's, he flipped through the brittle pages of his grandfather's own handwriting. He found the entry, November 2nd. "The Lord is good. The judge saw the truth today. Silas Morgan thought he could scare me with a piece of paper that looked official. He thought a poor cowboy wouldn't know how to read the law. But truth don't hide in fancy words. I looked Silas in the eye when they took him away. I didn't feel hate, just pity. A man who has to lie to get land will never be able to sleep on it peacefully. I'm going home to Mary and the boys. The land is ours, paid for with sweat, kept with truth." George ran his thumb over the ink. He could feel the indentation of the pen. The anger he had felt toward Julian evaporated, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Julian wasn't just wrong, he was dangerous. He was ready to destroy a family's history based on a surface-level scan too arrogant to do the real work. George looked up at Mrs. Gable. "Can I make a copy of this? A certified copy?" Mrs. Gable smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I'll do better than that. I'm the custodian of these records. I'll notarize a statement verifying the authenticity of this volume, and you can take the book with you. It's time this ledger saw the inside of a courtroom again, or at least a boardroom." George stood up and hugged the old woman. It was an embrace filled with gratitude that words couldn't express. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You saved my life tonight." "You saved your own, George," she said, patting his back. "You just needed to remember where to look. Now go show those city boys what a real investigation looks like." George walked out of the library with the heavy ledger tucked under his arm, the satchel in his other hand. The rain had started to fall, a gentle Texas shower that smelled of ozone and wet dust. He didn't run to the truck. He walked slowly, letting the rain cool his face. He felt 10 years younger. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the bearer of the truth. He got into his truck and placed the ledger on the passenger seat, strapping it in with the seatbelt as if it were a child. He started the engine and looked at his phone. Another message from Julian. "Time is ticking, Mr. Strait. We go live at 8 a.m. Have you written your apology?" George didn't reply. He threw the phone onto the seat next to the ledger. He put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the wet highway, turning the headlights toward Dallas. The city was 3 hours away. He would arrive just as the sun was coming up, just as the Veritas team was arriving with their lattes and their algorithms. The drive back was different. The fear was gone. In its place was a simmering, righteous anger. George thought about how many other families might have been destroyed by this company, how many other truths were just half-stories sold for clicks. He wasn't just going back to clear his name. He was going back to shut them down, or at least to teach them a lesson they would never forget. As he drove, he rehearsed what he would say. He wouldn't shout, he wouldn't scream. He would be calm, he would be Jedediah Strait's grandson. He would walk in there with the dust of the county on his boots and the weight of history in his hands. The miles flew by. The darkness of the countryside gave way to the sprawling suburbs, and then the towering skyline of Dallas glowing against the pre-dawn sky. It looked like a fortress of glass and light. But George knew that glass was fragile. One well-placed stone could bring it all down, and he had the stone. He pulled into the parking garage of the Veritas Tower at 6:30 a.m. The security guard at the gate recognized him, his eyes widening. "Mr. Strait? You're back early. I forgot something," George said, his voice level. "I forgot to finish the job." He parked the truck and grabbed the ledger and the satchel. He checked his reflection in the rear-view mirror. He looked tired. His eyes were red-rimmed. His shirt was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. He looked like a man who had been through a war. Perfect. He rode the elevator up to the 40th floor. The office was quiet. The cleaning crew was just finishing up. A few early risers were at their desks, the blue glow of screens illuminating their faces. They looked up as George walked in. The heavy thump of his boots on the floor was the only sound. He walked straight to Julian's office. The door was glass and he could see Julian inside, already on a conference call, gesturing animatedly. Julian saw George approaching and held up a finger, signaling him to wait. George didn't wait. He didn't stop. He pushed the door open and walked in. Julian looked annoyed, covering the microphone of his headset. "Mr. Strait, I am on a call with our PR team in New York. We are finalizing the release strategy. Please wait in the lobby." George walked up to the obsidian desk. He didn't say a word. He lifted the heavy, dust-covered ledger from under his arm. It was a stark contrast to the sleek technology in the room. It was old, ugly, and real. He dropped the ledger onto the desk. Thud. The sound was heavy, solid, and final. It shook the monitors. It made Julian jump. George leaned over the desk, placing his hands on the leather binding of the book. He looked Julian dead in the eye. "Hang up the phone, son," George said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonance that filled the room, a voice honed in stadiums and honky-tonks. "Hang up the phone, or you're going to look very foolish in about 5 minutes." Julian hesitated, looking from George's intense gaze to the dirty old book on his pristine desk. He saw something in the cowboy's eyes that unsettled him. It wasn't fear. It was certainty. Julian slowly took off the headset and placed it on the desk. He clicked a button to mute the call. "You have a lot of nerve barging in here," Julian said, trying to regain his composure. "Did you bring the apology?" "No," George said. "I brought the receipts." He opened the ledger to page 412. The smell of old paper wafted up, filling the sterile space. He pointed a calloused finger at the name Silas Morgan. "Read it," George commanded. Julian looked down, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the text, his brow furrowed. He read it again, slower this time. His face, usually so pale and composed, began to flush a deep, blotchy red. This is..." Julian stammered. "This is the truth," George interrupted. "The warrant you found? It was a fake, a forgery made by a crook to steal my grandfather's land. And the man who made it went to prison for it. My grandfather didn't steal the land, Julian. He protected it, and he protected the memory of the woman who owned it before him." Julian looked up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "But the algorithm, it matched the warrant." "The algorithm is stupid," George said, his voice cutting like a knife. "It's a machine. It doesn't know context. It doesn't know history. It only knows what you feed it. And you? You were so hungry for a scandal, so desperate to tear down a legend, that you didn't bother to check if the gun was loaded before you pulled the trigger." George reached into his satchel and pulled out his grandfather's personal diary. He opened it to the entry he had read in the library. "And here," George said, placing the diary next to the court ledger. "Here is the man's own words. Read what he felt. Read about the pity he had for the man who tried to frame him. That's the man you were about to call a thief." Julian was silent. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked at the screens around him, the press release, the graphics, the social media drafts. They were all based on a lie he was minutes away from broadcasting to the world. "If I hadn't gone to that library," George said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a shout, "you would have destroyed my family's name this morning. You would have done it with a smile on your face." Julian swallowed hard. "Mr. Strait, we can fix this. We can pivot. We can release this story instead. George Strait uncovers heroic past. It's even better." George looked at the man with pure disgust. He slowly closed the ledger. He picked up his hat and put it on. "You don't get it, do you?" George said. "This isn't content. This is my life, and you are done with it." He reached over the desk, his hand hovering over Julian's keyboard. "Delete it," George said. "What?" "Delete the file, the Morgan file, the draft, all of it, right now, while I watch." Julian hesitated. "But the data—" "Delete it!" George roared, slamming his hand on the desk. Julian flinched. His hands trembled as he reached for the mouse. He clicked on the folder. He dragged it to the trash bin. He clicked "Empty trash." The screen flashed. File deleted. George stood there for a moment, watching the progress bar disappear. The red pulse was gone. The threat was gone, but the anger remained. He picked up the ledger and the diary. He looked at Julian one last time. "You stick to your computers, son," George said. "Leave the history to the people who actually lived it." He turned to walk away, but stopped at the door. He looked back at the room of glass and screens. "And one more thing," George said. "If I ever see the name Veritas Ancestry mentioned in the same sentence as my family again, I won't come back with a book. I'll come back with a lawyer who makes this ledger look light as a feather." He walked out of the office, the door swinging shut behind him. The silence he left in his wake was absolute. The young employees in the outer office stared at him as he passed, but this time he didn't feel like a dinosaur. He felt like a king. George walked to the elevator, his heart rate finally slowing down. He pressed the button for the lobby. He was tired. He wanted to go home. He wanted to sit on his porch and watch the sun come up over the land that was truly, undeniably his. But as the elevator descended, he knew the story wasn't quite over. He had won the battle, but the war against the erasure of the past was ongoing. He had a responsibility now, not just to his grandfather, but to the truth itself. He looked at the ledger in his hands. It was heavy, awkward, and smelling of mildew, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever held. The doors opened to the lobby. The morning sun was streaming through the glass, blindingly bright. George adjusted his hat, shielding his eyes. He stepped out into the light, ready to face the day. He had found the dark truth, and he had shone a light on it until it disappeared. Now it was time to go home. The heavy glass doors of the Veritas Ancestry building slid shut behind George Strait, sealing the conditioned air and the digital lies inside. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the Texas morning greeted him not with a polite handshake, but with a warm, humid embrace. The sun was climbing higher, bleaching the concrete white, and the sounds of the city, traffic, construction, the distant wail of a siren washed over him. But for the first time in 24 hours, the noise didn't bother him. It was real. It was the sound of life happening, messy and loud, not the silent, creeping assassination of character he had just stopped in that tower. He walked to his truck, his boots feeling heavy but his spirit light. He unlocked the door and tossed the leather satchel onto the passenger seat, but he treated the county ledger with more reverence, placing it carefully on top of the journals. It was a holy relic now. That dusty, mildew-smelling book was the shield that had protected 3 generations of Straits. George climbed in and turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, a guttural mechanical sound that vibrated through the steering wheel and into his chest. He took a deep breath, exhaling the tension that had knotted his shoulders since yesterday. He pulled out his phone one last time. He didn't check Twitter, he didn't check the news. He opened his contacts and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Norma," he said when the line clicked open. His voice was raspy, worn down by the lack of sleep and the surplus of emotion. "George?" Her voice was sharp with worry. "You've been gone all night. You didn't call. I was about to drive up there myself. Is everything all right? Did you get the journals scanned?" George chuckled, a low, dry sound. "No, honey, we didn't get them scanned, and we never will, but everything is fine. Better than fine. I'm coming home. Put the coffee on and maybe get the boys together. I have a story I need to tell them." "What kind of story?" she asked, sensing the shift in his tone. "A true one," George replied. "I'll see you in 3 hours." He hung up and merged onto the highway, leaving the Dallas skyline in his rearview mirror. As the buildings shrank, turning into toy blocks against the vast blue sky, George felt the grip of the city loosening. He wasn't fleeing, he was returning. He was going back to the source. The drive south was a decompression chamber. As the concrete gave way to scrub oak and mesquite, George's mind replayed the confrontation with Julian. He thought about the arrogance of the man, the absolute certainty he had placed in a machine's interpretation of the world. It was a disease, George realized, a modern sickness where people believed that if something was on a screen, it was true, and if it wasn't, it didn't exist. They had forgotten that life happens in the margins, in the unrecorded moments, in the ink stains and the teardrops on a page. By the time the familiar wooden archway of his ranch came into view, the sun was high and fierce. The dust kicked up by his tires wasn't an annoyance, it was a welcome home banner. He drove up the long, winding driveway, past the paddocks where his horses grazed, their coats shining in the sun. They didn't care about algorithms, they didn't care about scandals. They cared about grass, water, and the kindness of the hand that fed them. That was a truth George could understand. He parked the truck in front of the main house. Norma was already on the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at him. Really looked at him, scanning his face for damage. She saw the exhaustion, yes, but she also saw the fire in his blue eyes, a fire that hadn't been there when he left. "You look like you went 12 rounds with a bull," she said as he climbed the steps, the heavy ledger tucked under his arm. "Felt like it," George said, kissing her on the forehead. But the bull blinked first. He walked into the house, the cool interior smelling of lemon polish and baking bread. It was the smell of safety. He went straight to the dining room table and set the ledger down. It looked out of place on the polished mahogany, a dirty, crumbling brick of history, but George thought it was the most beautiful centerpiece he had ever seen. "Where's Harvey?" George asked, taking off his hat and hanging it on the back of a chair. "In the den," Norma said, watching him closely. "Playing on that tablet of his, you know how he is." George nodded. "Send him in here, and tell him to leave the tablet." Norma hesitated, then nodded. She knew better than to ask questions when George had that tone. It wasn't anger, it was purpose. A few minutes later, his grandson, Harvey, walked into the dining room. He was 12 years old, wearing a baseball cap backward and a t-shirt with a video game character on it. He looked confused, his hands twitching slightly as if missing the device he had just surrendered. "Grandma said you wanted to see me, Pop," Harvey said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Is something wrong? Did I forget to do my chores?" "No, son," George said, pulling out a chair. "Sit down." Harvey sat, looking warily at the dirty book on the table. "What's that? It smells like the barn." "This," George said, placing his hand on the cover, "is a time machine." Harvey rolled his eyes, a classic pre-teen gesture. "Come on, Pop, that's just an old book." "Is it?" George leaned forward. "Yesterday, a man in a skyscraper in Dallas tried to use a computer to tell the world that your great-grandfather was a thief. He had a digital picture that said, 'Jedediah Strait stole this ranch and hurt a woman to get it.'" Harvey's eyes went wide. "What? But great-grandpa built this place. You always said—" "I know what I said," George interrupted gently. "But this man had data, he had a scan, he had the internet on his side, and he was going to destroy our name, Harvey. He was going to make it so that every time someone searched for Strait on Google, they saw the word criminal." Harvey looked scared now. The internet was his world. To be branded, there was a fate worse than death. "So, what did you do? Did you sue him?" "No," George said. "I went to the library." He opened the ledger to page 412. He pointed to the faded ink. "I found the paper," George whispered. "I found the real story. The computer saw a warrant and thought it was real. But this book knew that the warrant was a fake, planted by a bad man. This book proved that Jedediah was a hero, not a villain." George watched his grandson's face. He saw the gears turning. He saw the realization dawning that the screen he worshipped wasn't infallible. "I see, Harvey," George continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We live in a world where everyone wants to be fast. They want the answer in a second. They want the headline, not the story. But the truth isn't fast. The truth is slow. It's heavy. It's buried in boxes in basements. And if you don't know how to look for it, if you don't respect the paper and the ink, you'll believe whatever lie the machine tells you." He pushed the ledger toward the boy. "Read it." Harvey reached out, his fingers hesitant. He touched the rough paper. He squinted at the cursive handwriting. It took him a moment to decipher the loops and swirls of 1923, but as he read, his posture changed. He sat up straighter, He wasn't reading a screen, he was touching the past. Verdict, guilty, Harvey read slowly. Silas Morgan, forgery. He looked up at George, a smile breaking across his face. He won. Grandpa Jedediah won. He won because he stood his ground, George said. And we won today because we remembered him. Not just the idea of him, but the proof of him. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He held it up next to the ledger. This thing, George said, shaking the phone, is a tool. It's useful, but it's not your brain, and it's sure as hell not your heart. Don't ever let it tell you who you are. You come from people who wrote things down, people who signed their names in ink. Don't you ever forget that. Harvey looked from the phone to the ledger. He nodded, slowly at first, then with conviction. I won't, Pop. Good, George said. Now I want you to take this book. I want you to read it, not just that page, all of it. Learn about the people in this county. Learn about the fights they had and the peace they made. Because one day, I won't be here to tell you. And this book will be all you have to defend this land. Harvey pulled the heavy book onto his lap. He looked small behind it, but George saw the potential. He saw the future guardian of the legacy. That evening, the sun began its descent, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. The same sky George had seen on his drive to the library, but now it felt like a benediction rather than a warning. George sat on the back porch, a guitar resting idly on his knee. He wasn't playing, just holding it, feeling the vibration of the wood against his chest. Norma came out with 2 glasses of iced tea. She sat in the rocking chair beside him. They watched the swallows diving for insects over the pasture. You saved us, George, she said softly. I don't think you realize how close we came to losing everything. Not the money, the honor. I realized it, George said, taking a sip of the tea. When I sat in that office looking at that blue light, I felt like I was drowning. I felt like everything I'd ever done, every song I ever sang, was being erased by a line of code. But you fought back, she said. I didn't fight, George corrected her. I just remembered. That's the trick, Norma. In a world that wants to delete everything, remembering is an act of rebellion. He looked out at the horizon. He thought about Julian Thorne. He wondered if the young man was still sitting in his glass tower, staring at a blank screen, wondering where his data had gone wrong. George didn't wish him ill. He just pitied him. A man without a past is a man without a foundation. When the wind blows, he falls. I'm going to make a change, George said suddenly. What kind of change? I'm done with the archives project, no more digitizing. If people want to know the history of the Strait family, they can come here. They can sit on this porch. They can drink your tea, and I'll tell them, eye to eye, the way it used to be. Norma smiled. You know that's impossible. You have millions of fans. Then I'll tell them one at a time, George grinned. Or I'll put it in a song. A song lasts longer than a server anyway. He picked up the guitar and strummed a G chord. It rang out clear and true, fading into the cricket's chirp. I learned something else too, George mused, his fingers dancing over the fretboard. That dark truth I was so scared of. It wasn't about Jedediah. It was about me. I was scared because I didn't know for sure. I had let the stories fade just enough that doubt could creep in. I won't let that happen again. I'm going to teach Harvey everything, not just the good parts. The hard parts too, the droughts, the debts, the fights, because if you hide the scars, you forget how you healed. The screen door creaked open, and Harvey stepped out. He wasn't holding his tablet. He was holding a notepad and a pen. Pop, he asked, can I ask you something about the ledger? There's a name in here. Old Man McGregor. Who was he? George's face lit up. He set the guitar down and patted the spot on the bench next to him. Old Man McGregor? George chuckled. Well, son, that's a story involving a 3-legged dog and a barrel of moonshine. Sit down. You're going to want to write this down. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the ranch in the soft gray light of twilight, the scene was perfect. An old man, a young boy, and a story passing between them like a torch. Far away in Dallas, the servers of Veritas Ancestry hummed in the dark, processing terabytes of data, searching for connections, searching for scandals. But they would never find this. They would never capture the sound of a grandfather's voice, or the scratch of a pen on paper. George Strait had found a dark truth about how the world was changing, yes. He had seen the abyss of the digital age, where truth is malleable and history is a commodity. But he had also found the antidote. It wasn't a firewall, it wasn't a lawsuit. It was the dust on his boots, it was the ink in the ledger, it was the blood in his veins. He took a breath of the cooling air, smelling the sage and the earth. He was George Strait. He was the grandson of Jedediah, and as long as he had breath in his lungs and a story to tell, the truth would be just fine. He looked at Harvey, scribbling furiously in his notebook. "Did he really drink the whole barrel?" Harvey asked, eyes wide. "Every drop," George winked, and lived to be 92. "Now turn the page, son. The next chapter is about the flood of 35. That's when we learned that water can take everything, but it can't take your faith." The night settled in, wrapping the ranch in silence and stars. The digital world continued to spin, frantic and loud, but here, on the dusty road that led to the heart of Texas, everything was still. Everything was real. And that was enough.